Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin, a huge thanks for your support. If you love the mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's chilling tale. The Caribbean Sea has long been romanticized in stories of pirates, treasure hunts, and legends of buried gold. But behind the shiny allure of adventure lies a darker truth, one that involves real-life pirates whose smuggling operations far outstripped the fiction of the movies. The story you're about to hear is no fantasy. It's a tale of cunning, danger, and a massive network that spanned across oceans, far beyond the sandy beaches and idyllic landscapes of the Caribbean. For decades, a vast smuggling empire operated in the Caribbean, shrouded in secrecy and, at times, even mystique. These smugglers, far from the swashbuckling caricatures depicted in popular culture, were ruthless, highly organized, and skilled in their methods. Their operation wasn't just about illicit trade. It was a life-or-death business, one where fortunes were built and lost, and lives were sacrificed in the pursuit of power and wealth. The real pirates of the Caribbean were far more than the iconic characters we know today. They were powerful, elusive, and, for many, untouchable. Operating under the radar of governments and law enforcement, these smugglers built an underground network that lasted for decades, influencing both local economies and global trade routes. Their tactics were advanced, often involving elaborate subterfuge, bribery, and manipulation, strategies that would make even the most cunning fictional pirate seem amateurish. At the heart of this operation was not a singular pirate, but a syndicate of criminals, each more dangerous than the next, operating with a level of sophistication rarely seen in illicit operations of that scale. These were the true pirates, individuals whose names may never be known, but whose actions impacted entire regions. And their story, long forgotten by most, deserves to be uncovered. But as we delve deeper into this hidden history, we begin to ask ourselves, how did these pirates manage to outsmart authorities for so long? What was their legacy? And how did they leave their mark on the Caribbean's real-world history? The answers lie not in the tales spun by Hollywood, but in the forgotten accounts of those who lived through the smuggling empire that shaped an entire region. Now, let's peel back the layers of history and uncover the true pirates who terrorized the Caribbean waters, leaving behind a trail of riches, deception, and a legacy that still reverberates today. The Caribbean, once a vast sea of untouched beauty, became a nexus of both opportunity and danger during the 16th and 17th centuries. Rich in resources and strategically located between the Americas and Europe, the islands and surrounding waters attracted more than just settlers and explorers. Pirates and smugglers saw the Caribbean as a perfect location to profit from the lucrative trade routes and natural wealth. This was the birth of a new kind of pirate, one who wasn't just interested in treasure chests but sought control over the seas themselves, using their cunning and violence to claim dominance. In the 1500s, European powers, particularly Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, vied for control of the Caribbean islands. Spain, with its vast colonial empire in the Americas, sought to monopolize the wealth flowing from the New World. Gold, silver, sugar, and tobacco were highly valuable commodities, and the Spanish, though powerful, struggled to protect their vast empire from marauding pirates. These pirates, originally known as privateers, licensed by governments to attack enemy ships, soon became ruthless criminals once they turned their attention to unprotected merchant vessels, many of which belonged to their own countries. As piracy became more rampant, smuggling operations flourished in the Caribbean. Unlike traditional piracy, which was often focused on attacking ships and capturing treasures, smuggling was a far more secretive, calculated operation. Smugglers would bring in goods that were heavily taxed or outright illegal, items like alcohol, tobacco, and weapons, into colonies where such items were either restricted or highly taxed. These smugglers often worked in secrecy, using hidden coves and uncharted islands as staging areas to bring their goods to market. One of the key reasons the Caribbean became a hotspot for these illicit operations was the sheer number of islands. Over 7,000 islands, cays, and reefs dotted the sea, offering perfect hiding spots for smuggling ships. The narrow channels and shallow waters, while dangerous for regular vessels, were perfect for smaller, faster ships that could evade detection. Smugglers were masters of evasion, using fast schooners and bribes to navigate the complicated waters where larger ships dared not tread. With so many islands, many of which were sparsely populated or largely unregulated, smugglers could unload their goods with little risk of being caught. During the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean, between the late 1600s and early 1700s, pirates like Blackbeard and Henry Morgan became infamous for their attacks on merchant ships. However, not all pirates were cut from the same cloth. Many were also deeply involved in smuggling operations. In fact, some of the most profitable smuggling operations were run by pirates who had become quite skilled at working in the shadows, using their pirate identities as a cover for more organized covert operations. Pirates who had once been outlaws found themselves in a strange symbiotic relationship with the colonial powers. When the pirates weren't actively attacking ships, they were often working with corrupt officials who looked the other way in exchange for a cut of the illicit profits. This partnership was crucial for the survival of the smuggling operations. Smugglers didn't just rely on the pirate ships for protection. They needed local knowledge of the island systems, of the best locations to land their cargo without detection, and of the politics that made it all possible. This network of pirates and corrupt officials ensured that goods could be brought into places like Jamaica, Cuba, and the Bahamas, free from the eyes of the law. By the mid-1700s, pirates and smugglers had established their dominance over many Caribbean islands. The British, in particular, struggled to control the region due to the constant threats from both pirates and other colonial powers. As smuggling became more widespread, so did the influence of the pirates who ran the operations. It wasn't just ships that were smuggled, people were as well. Enslaved individuals, fugitives, and even some of the most wanted criminals found refuge in these pirate-controlled areas. Many islands, such as Tortuga and Nassau, became havens for such individuals, where they could live without fear of punishment. As the 18th century wore on, smuggling operations grew bolder and more sophisticated. Pirates, having mastered the art of evading the law, began creating hidden hideouts and building large stockpiles of smuggled goods. Their network spread far and wide across the Caribbean, linking islands and coastal regions together. But even as these pirate operations flourished, so did the laws of the colonial powers. The British and French began cracking down on piracy and smuggling more severely in the late 1700s, deploying large naval fleets to chase down the pirates and break their operations. Despite the heavy crackdown, pirates and smugglers managed to survive well into the 19th century. In fact, some of the largest and most profitable smuggling rings operated through the 1800s, even as colonial powers were working to stamp out piracy entirely. By the time the 20th century arrived, piracy in the Caribbean had mostly faded, but the legacy of those smuggling operations lingered on. The stories of pirate treasure, hidden islands, and elaborate trade routes continued to captivate the imagination of those who studied the region. Today, the Caribbean still holds echoes of its piratical past. Many of the islands that once served as pirate hideouts are now popular tourist destinations, drawing visitors eager to catch a glimpse of the history that made them infamous. However, beneath the tourist-friendly facade lies a legacy of smuggling operations that changed the Caribbean forever. While the pirates themselves have faded into history, the smuggling networks they created and the methods they perfected remain an integral part of the region's story. What's even more fascinating is that these smuggling operations may not have completely disappeared. There are still reports of illicit trade in the Caribbean today. Drug cartels and modern smugglers have inherited the legacy of their pirate predecessors. This hidden network of trade, while not as glamorous as the tales of buried treasure, continues to thrive in the shadows of the Caribbean's blue waters. The legacy of the real pirates of the Caribbean lives on in ways that most people never see, as the region's past influences its present in ways both dark and mysterious. The rise of piracy in the Caribbean wasn't a sudden phenomenon. It was the product of a confluence of factors: the vast trade networks between Europe and the New World, the allure of wealth, and the breakdown of colonial authority in the face of relentless attacks. As European powers vied for control over the islands and their trade routes, they inadvertently created an environment where piracy could thrive. However, it wasn't just about plunder and chaos. Piracy became a system of rebellion and survival, a way for outcasts, ex-soldiers, and opportunists to carve out their own domain in an otherwise unforgiving world. By the late 17th century, the Caribbean had become a chaotic battleground of competing empires. Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands were locked in a bitter struggle for dominance over the region's wealth. The Spanish, in particular, were the dominant power in the New World, controlling vast swathes of land from Mexico to South America, but their resources were stretched thin. Their empire was vast, yet much of it was poorly defended, especially in the Caribbean. With little military presence in some areas, Spanish ships carrying treasures from the Americas to Europe became easy targets for pirates who were keen on capitalizing on Spain's vulnerability. During this period, piracy was often viewed as a necessary evil. Governments turned a blind eye to the actions of privateers, pirates who were given government sanction to attack enemy ships in exchange for a share of the loot. These privateers played a crucial role in the conflict, as they helped to disrupt the rival trade routes and weaken the Spanish hold on the Caribbean. But as the wars between European powers began to settle, these privateers found themselves out of work, and many turned to full-fledged piracy. With no nation to support their activities, they became true outlaws, feared by both colonial authorities and the merchant ships they preyed upon. Pirates like Blackbeard, Edward Teach, Henry Morgan, and Bartholomew Roberts became infamous figures during this era. While their stories are now part of the mythic lore of the Caribbean, their rise was anything but accidental. These pirates were astute strategists who understood the value of alliances, the importance of local knowledge, and the sheer brutality required to dominate the Caribbean seas. Their operations were sophisticated, well-planned, and highly organized. They were not mere bandits. They were businessmen, using violence and fear to secure their fortunes. The pirate stronghold of Nassau, located in the Bahamas, became the epicenter of this new breed of pirate. It was a place where pirates could rest, repair their ships, and plan their next raids. It was also a haven for those looking to escape the law. By the early 1700s, Nassau was home to a bustling pirate community, and it became a symbol of rebellion against colonial rule. The pirates who lived there didn't just plunder for personal gain. They created a network that rivaled the colonial powers in both influence and control. They even established a form of government, with pirate codes that governed the behavior of pirates and ensured that treasure was distributed fairly among the crew. At the helm of many of these pirate operations were men who had once been privateers or even soldiers in the service of European monarchs. Their background gave them an edge over the average sailor. They knew how to fight, how to navigate the treacherous waters of the Caribbean, and how to engage in complex tactical maneuvers. Their leadership was based not only on their ability to command ships but also on their charisma and ability to inspire loyalty in their crew. Pirates like Henry Morgan were not only feared for their ruthlessness but admired for their ability to get the job done. Morgan's raid on Panama in 1671 is one of the most legendary pirate victories, where he defeated a much larger Spanish force, capturing a city full of treasure. His success cemented his reputation and garnered him both fame and fortune. However, piracy was not limited to just the big names in history. Countless lesser-known pirates were part of this massive operation, each contributing to the rise of the pirate empire in the Caribbean. Many pirates were originally sailors who had grown disillusioned with the strict discipline of naval service or had turned to piracy after being pressed into service during wars. Others were former slaves, criminals, and adventurers who had found a place among the pirates, where there was opportunity for advancement based on merit, rather than birth or status. As these pirates rose to power, so did their operations. The pirates of the Caribbean were not just raiding merchant ships. They were also deeply involved in smuggling. The wealth generated by piracy allowed these pirates to create elaborate smuggling networks that extended far beyond the Caribbean. They had established safe havens in remote islands, where they could stash their stolen goods before distributing them across the globe. These smuggling operations became increasingly sophisticated, often involving intricate routes that bypassed the watchful eyes of colonial authorities. One such smuggling operation was the trade of slaves. Pirates and smugglers played a significant role in the transatlantic slave trade. They often captured enslaved people from ships and sold them in the Caribbean, creating a thriving economy built on human misery. Smuggling was also involved in the trade of goods such as sugar, tobacco, and weapons, items that were heavily taxed or prohibited by colonial governments. Pirates knew how to exploit the colony's need for these goods and made significant profits by illegally transporting them through their extensive network. The rise of these pirates and smugglers coincided with a period of intense political instability in the Caribbean. Colonial powers, particularly the British, found themselves struggling to maintain control over the vast and remote Caribbean islands. With the rise of the pirate syndicates, the lines between law and lawlessness became increasingly blurred. In many cases, pirates were not just outlaws. They were political players, striking deals with local authorities to further their own interests. Some pirates even established their own kingdoms on various islands, where they exercised control over the local population and the economic activity. However, as the pirate community grew bolder, so did the pressure from European colonial powers to crush piracy. By the early 18th century, the British Navy had begun an aggressive campaign to eradicate piracy in the Caribbean. They imposed harsh punishments on pirates, executed those they captured, and sought to dismantle the pirate strongholds that had sprung up in Nassau and other parts of the Caribbean. This campaign had some success, but it also pushed piracy into even more secretive operations, where it continued to thrive in the shadows of colonial rule. Yet even as the British Navy launched its crackdown, piracy and smuggling continued to play a significant role in Caribbean society. Pirates may have been outlawed, but their legacy endured in the island's culture, economy, and folklore. The pirates' rise to power in the Caribbean wasn't just a series of isolated raids. It was a revolution, a moment in history where outcasts and adventurers built their own world, a world that would continue to influence the region long after the last pirate ship sailed. The smuggling operation in the Caribbean, a carefully orchestrated web of illicit trade and clandestine networks, was far more complex than the simple plundering of treasure ships. It was a carefully crafted system that operated beneath the surface of the Caribbean's vibrant economy, and its scale and sophistication were unparalleled in the history of piracy. Far from the glorified image of pirates as simple criminals, these smuggling operations were often run by seasoned professionals who treated their illicit trade as a business venture, calculating risk and reward with precision. Their reach extended far beyond the Caribbean, touching the coasts of Europe, Africa, and even the Americas, playing a pivotal role in shaping the early modern global economy. The allure of the Caribbean was not just the vast natural resources, the gold, and the sugar. It was the position the islands held within the transatlantic trade. The Caribbean sat in the middle of the world's most important trade routes, making it an ideal location for smugglers. European powers sought to monopolize the wealth from the New World, often imposing exorbitant taxes or outright bans on certain goods, and this created a lucrative market for smuggling. Smugglers found a way to bypass the high costs of legitimate trade and the restrictions imposed by colonial governments. Whether it was the shipment of tobacco, alcohol, or weapons, the goods smuggled through the Caribbean would be sold at a significant profit, allowing those involved to amass fortunes in a world that thrived on secrecy and stealth. One of the most profitable and deadly smuggling trades in the Caribbean was the trafficking of enslaved people. Although slavery had been deeply entrenched in the New World economy, the transatlantic slave trade became highly regulated in the late 17th and 18th centuries. With European powers attempting to crack down on illegal slave imports, smugglers saw an opportunity to fill the void. Enslaved Africans were brought into the Caribbean under the cover of night, hidden on the lower decks of ships under false paperwork or false destinations. Pirates and smugglers often acted as middlemen, obtaining enslaved people from other pirate ships or hidden in remote coastal areas, only to sell them in the Caribbean or mainland Americas. These smugglers did not just operate on land or water. They controlled entire networks of individuals, including local plantation owners, corrupt officials, and dock workers, all of whom played crucial roles in ensuring that the illicit trade continued without interference from colonial authorities. It was a system of complicity that spanned across the economic and political spectrum, with those involved being paid handsomely for their loyalty to the pirate lords and smugglers. But it wasn't only the big names in piracy who had a stake in this operation. Every sailor, every worker in the Caribbean ports, and every person who handled goods became part of a vast web of secrecy that kept the entire operation running smoothly. The transportation of goods like rum, sugar, and tobacco was another vital part of the smuggling operation. The Caribbean, particularly islands like Cuba and Jamaica, produced some of the world's finest rum and sugar. Yet, colonial taxes and import tariffs often made these goods prohibitively expensive to import to Europe and the Americas. Smugglers who were able to avoid customs duties and taxes could sell these goods at a much higher profit, sometimes even undercutting the legal market. Pirates, who had once been seen as lawless vagabonds, became strategic entrepreneurs in the Caribbean, using their knowledge of the sea and local geography to deliver products at the best price while evading detection. The methods used by these pirates were ingenious. The smugglers, using fast, nimble ships, often employed complex tactics to avoid capture. They would slip into hidden coves, avoid major ports, and sail in and out of narrow straits that were difficult to patrol. The ships themselves were often outfitted with the latest technology, such as special sails that allowed them to outrun faster naval ships. Some pirates even used decoys, sending one ship off in one direction to distract naval patrols, while the actual ship carrying contraband moved quietly in the opposite direction. These smuggling operations were not only conducted on the high seas but often in the heart of colonial settlements, where goods would be stored in plain sight, hidden behind innocuous facades. The smuggling operation also thrived on the alliances forged with local leaders and governors. Pirates, far from being lone criminals, often formed symbiotic relationships with colonial officials who were complicit in their trade. In exchange for a cut of the profits, officials would overlook illegal activities, ensuring that the pirate operations went undetected. These alliances created a shadow network that spanned across the Caribbean, from the islands of the Bahamas to the coast of South America. In fact, many of the most successful pirate lords of the Caribbean were not only feared by their crews and enemies but respected by local authorities for their ability to evade capture and provide protection in return for a share of the spoils. One of the most infamous pirate strongholds in the Caribbean was Nassau in the Bahamas, a pirate utopia that served as both a haven and a central hub for smuggling. By the early 18th century, Nassau had become a pirate republic of sorts, where pirates could rest, repair their ships, and sell their loot. The island's location, surrounded by shallow waters and numerous small islands, made it an ideal place for pirates to hide from naval patrols. The pirates who lived in Nassau were not just lawless brigands, they were businessmen, and Nassau became the center of a thriving illicit trade. Smugglers would bring their goods to Nassau, where they could find buyers among the island's population, ranging from the plantation owners to wealthy merchants who benefited from the cheap, untaxed goods. The success of Nassau as a pirate stronghold caught the attention of both the British Crown and the Spanish Empire. By 1718, the British government, determined to wipe out piracy, sent a naval fleet to capture or kill the pirates who had taken refuge there. Despite the military onslaught, many pirates managed to escape, using their knowledge of the islands to avoid capture. Nassau's smuggling operations continued for years, even after it became the target of British efforts to impose law and order. In fact, some of the most successful pirates in history, like Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, operated out of Nassau, taking advantage of its many hidden coves and complex trade routes. Pirates who smuggled goods out of Nassau and other pirate havens were not just criminals. They were also playing an essential role in global trade. Without the piracy and smuggling that flowed through the Caribbean, European markets would have lacked many of the goods that were vital to the economy. Smugglers transported not just the products of the Caribbean, but also goods that were highly sought after in Europe, such as spices, textiles, and metals. The smuggling operation didn't just affect the Caribbean, it was a vital link in the chain of the early global economy, connecting the New World with the Old World in ways that were largely unseen by the general population. The success of these smuggling operations, however, came with a price. Smugglers were always under threat from colonial authorities who sought to restore order and crack down on illegal trade. Many of the pirates who were involved in smuggling found themselves on the run, constantly moving from one island to another in an effort to avoid capture. Yet, even as colonial powers grew more determined to stop piracy and smuggling, the operation persisted. New smuggling routes emerged, and the pirates' adaptability ensured that their influence in the Caribbean remained strong, even in the face of relentless opposition from the British Navy and other colonial powers. The legacy of the Caribbean smuggling operation born out of piracy, continued to shape the region's history long after the so-called Golden Age of piracy came to an end. In many ways, the smuggling operations established a network that laid the foundation for modern-day organized crime. The methods used by pirates, secrecy, speed, and an intimate knowledge of the environment remain relevant in contemporary criminal organizations, particularly in areas where borders and customs are easy to bypass. In today's world, some of the methods that were once used by pirates still live on. Smuggling networks in the Caribbean, though less publicized, continue to thrive. Whether it is in the trafficking of drugs or other illicit goods, the same ingenuity that drove the original pirates' operations remains part of the Caribbean's complex legacy. While the world of Caribbean piracy and smuggling remained hidden in the shadows for centuries, it wasn't until Hollywood's involvement that the full extent of this dark chapter in history began to enter the public's imagination. The Pirates of the Caribbean films, with their mix of adventure, romance, and supernatural flair, are based on the legends and myths surrounding piracy in the Caribbean. However, these films, while entertaining, do not fully capture the reality of what piracy and smuggling operations in the region actually entailed. What the films did manage to do, however, was immortalize a specific vision of pirates that blurred the line between myth and reality, shaping how generations of people view this aspect of Caribbean history. The connection between the real pirates and the Hollywood portrayal of piracy is a curious one. On the surface, the swashbuckling antics of Captain Jack Sparrow and his crew seem far removed from the brutal, often bloody, reality of the pirate world in the Caribbean. Yet beneath the surface, the films capture certain elements of pirate life that are rooted in truth. These pirates were not just men of the sea, they were often businessmen, operating intricate smuggling networks, and they lived by their own codes of conduct that were far from the romantic ideals portrayed in films. The Pirates of the Caribbean films, particularly the first one, The Curse of the Black Pearl, were inspired by the long history of Caribbean piracy. The film's iconic opening, with the appearance of Captain Jack Sparrow sailing into Port Royal on a sinking ship, is a nod to the many pirates who used their ships as a means to evade capture or make daring escapes. The films also brought to life the notorious pirate characters, such as Captain Hector Barbassa and the cursed pirate crew of the Black Pearl, whose actions were loosely based on real-life pirate lore. Yet, despite the film's undeniable influence in popularizing the idea of the Caribbean pirate, the Hollywood version significantly alters the narrative. The Pirates of the Caribbean are exaggerated, larger-than-life characters, often with supernatural elements that have no place in the real pirate world. While historical pirates certainly faced dangerous enemies, treasure hunts, and violent confrontations, the idea of pirates being cursed, possessing magical compasses, and dealing with supernatural forces is a complete fabrication. This fantastical aspect of the films adds an element of mystery and excitement, but it also obscures the reality of how piracy and smuggling operated in the Caribbean. The romanticized version of piracy that Hollywood has presented also plays on the notion of pirates as rebels, fighting against oppressive forces. In many ways, this mirrors the true history of piracy in the Caribbean, where pirates often position themselves as outlaws, rebelling against the colonial powers that sought to control trade and resources. However, this idealization of piracy ignores the fact that many pirates were involved in the very same systems of exploitation and brutality that they purported to fight against. Pirates were often no better than the colonial governments they opposed, engaging in the same tactics of violence, extortion, and manipulation to achieve their goals. The relationship between Hollywood and the real pirates goes deeper than just the portrayal of pirate life in the films. In fact, the success of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise owes much to the myths and legends that surround Caribbean piracy. The film series taps into the cultural nostalgia for pirate lore, particularly the image of treasure-filled islands, swashbuckling heroes, and colorful villains. This romanticized version of pirates is something that has persisted in literature and film for centuries, with classic works like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island continuing to influence how we view pirates today. The Disney franchise did something unique, though. It reintroduced piracy to modern audiences by blending elements of humor, horror, and fantasy. Captain Jack Sparrow became an iconic figure who blended reckless charm with a deep sense of cunning, embodying both the good and bad traits of a pirate. His popularity led to a revival of interest in Caribbean piracy, both as a cinematic and historical subject. However, the success of Pirates of the Caribbean also led to the growth of pirate tourism, with places like Nassau and Port Royal marketing themselves as destinations where you could step into the world of pirates, much like the movie portrayed. Yet while the films certainly owe their existence to the mythic versions of pirates and Caribbean history, they also had an impact on how people began to view the region's past. The connection between piracy, treasure hunting, and the Caribbean's golden age of smuggling began to feel like part of the collective cultural memory, thanks to the visibility Hollywood provided. The films drew on the existing stories of notorious pirates and smuggling networks, but in doing so, they also elevated them to a level of fantasy that left many believing in a version of history that was far removed from the gritty reality that those involved in piracy and smuggling faced. Interestingly, the success of the Pirates of the Caribbean films also sparked renewed interest in the true stories of the Caribbean's piratical past. The popularity of the films led historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters to revisit many of the locations featured in the films, seeking out buried treasures, shipwrecks, and forgotten pirate strongholds. What followed was a wave of pirate-related tourism in the Caribbean, where visitors could go on guided tours to the sites of legendary pirate battles or see the islands where famous pirates, such as Blackbeard, once roamed. The idea of buried treasure became a focal point in these tours, and many tourists visited these sites in search of a glimpse into the world that inspired the Pirates of the Caribbean films. In some cases, treasure hunters even set out to recover artifacts from shipwrecks, sometimes even unearthing relics from real pirate ships that had been lost for centuries. These ventures were often funded by the growing popularity of pirate-themed adventures, with Pirates of the Caribbean serving as a modern gateway to a world steeped in legend. However, the resurgence of pirate lore in modern culture has also brought attention to the more troubling aspects of piracy in the Caribbean, aspects that are often ignored in popular media. For instance, pirates were often responsible for the brutal treatment of enslaved Africans, engaging in the trafficking of human lives as a way to expand their wealth. Smugglers in the Caribbean, too, were deeply involved in the exploitation of both land and people, making their fortunes off the backs of slaves and the impoverished. Hollywood's Pirates of the Caribbean films are enjoyable and exciting adventures that have captured the imagination of millions of viewers. Yet they also mask the darker aspects of Caribbean piracy, from the economic exploitation of enslaved peoples to the brutal tactics employed by pirates. While Hollywood has made pirates larger than life, the true legacy of Caribbean piracy is far more complex and much darker than what we see on the silver screen. The films have certainly brought pirates back into the spotlight, but they have also obscured the reality of what piracy and smuggling were truly about. Pirates weren't always the colorful heroes and anti-heroes we see in the movies. They were ruthless criminals who lived by a code of violence and self-interest. The connection between Hollywood and the real pirates of the Caribbean is a fascinating one, but it is important to remember that the stories we see on screen are far from the full truth of the region's history. As we dig deeper into the smuggling operations, the pirates' reign, and the legacy of these real-world criminals, it becomes clear that the Pirates of the Caribbean films, while entertaining, are just a surface-level interpretation of a much darker and more complex past. A past that continues to shape the Caribbean even today. By the early 18th century, the age of piracy in the Caribbean was beginning to face significant pressure from both colonial powers and internal conflicts. What had once been a thriving enterprise of illicit trade and high-seas robbery was slowly being dismantled by an increasingly organized response from European empires. The pirates who once ruled the Caribbean with impunity began to feel the heat of military action, government intervention, and shifting global economies that left piracy unsustainable. Despite their initial success, these pirates and smugglers were on borrowed time, and the winds of change were blowing strongly against them. The decline of piracy in the Caribbean can be traced back to a number of key factors, starting with the aggressive response by the British Navy. In the early 1700s, Britain, which had already built a vast colonial empire spanning the globe, grew increasingly concerned with the growing pirate presence in the Caribbean. Pirates, especially those based in Nassau, were undermining British authority and damaging the flow of goods and commerce that was vital to the empire's wealth. British officials were not content to let pirates roam free, and soon, a concerted effort to eradicate them began. In 1718, the British government decided to take definitive action against the pirates who had made Nassau their home. A naval fleet, led by Commodore Woodes Rogers, was sent to the Bahamas with the goal of eradicating the pirate stronghold. Rogers, a former privateer who knew the ways of pirates, was appointed the new royal governor of the Bahamas, a strategic position that gave him the authority to not only challenge piracy but also to offer pardons to any pirate who surrendered. The British government's policy was simple. Pirates who agreed to give up their criminal ways would be spared, but those who resisted would face the full wrath of the British Navy. At first, many pirates in Nassau believed they could withstand the British forces, but they were ill-prepared for the well-equipped navy that Rogers commanded. Nassau, once a thriving hub of piracy, was slowly emptied as many pirates fled to other islands or were captured. Those who stayed were given a choice: surrender or face execution. The British crackdown on piracy in the Caribbean marked the beginning of the end for the golden age of piracy in the region. With the pirates' base of operations destroyed, their networks of smuggling and robbery began to crumble. However, even as British naval forces cracked down on piracy, there were other factors contributing to the pirates' downfall. Over time, the golden age of piracy began to wane because of the changing nature of global trade. The rise of more efficient, well-defended trade routes and the increasing sophistication of colonial authorities made piracy a less viable career. By the early 18th century, the European powers had established stronger naval forces and more fortified coastal settlements, effectively making it more difficult for pirates to attack with the same impunity they once had. Piracy was no longer a way to easily amass wealth. It had become a much more dangerous and less profitable pursuit. Additionally, the piracy business itself had evolved. What began as opportunistic, disorganized plundering became more structured and less romanticized. Pirates had always been ruthless criminals, but in the beginning, their tactics and methods were driven largely by a sense of freedom and rebellion. However, as piracy became more widespread, it began to attract more professional criminals who were less interested in the myth of pirate freedom and more interested in profit. This shift in mentality meant that pirates were often more violent and less willing to cooperate with one another. The once prominent pirate crews, united by a common goal and a shared code, began to fragment and turn on each other as competition for treasure and territory grew fiercer. Infighting among pirates undermined the cohesiveness that had once made them a formidable force in the Caribbean. The downfall of piracy was also accelerated by the growing influence of colonial authorities and their ability to infiltrate pirate networks. As piracy became a more organized criminal enterprise, it attracted the attention of more sophisticated law enforcement. Pirates had once been able to hide among the population of the Caribbean, blending in with sailors, merchants, and dockworkers. But as colonial governments grew stronger, they implemented measures to root out piracy at its core. One of the most effective methods was the introduction of bounties on pirate heads. The British, in particular, began offering substantial rewards to those who could capture pirates, either dead or alive. This created a system where local authorities, merchants, and even pirates themselves could profit by betraying their fellow criminals. The pirate community that had once operated with a sense of brotherhood and camaraderie now began to distrust each other, further destabilizing the pirate world. The execution of the infamous pirate Blackbeard, Edward Teach, in 1718 was one of the most symbolic moments in the decline of Caribbean piracy. Blackbeard had been one of the most feared pirates of his time, his name evoking terror throughout the region. He was known for his brutal tactics, often using intimidation and fear to dominate his victims. His death at the hands of British naval forces marked the end of an era. Blackbeard had been a symbol of pirate power and rebellion, and his death signaled to pirates everywhere that their way of life was no longer sustainable. Despite his death, Blackbeard's legacy lived on in the pirate lore that would come to define the Caribbean's pirate history. The British also employed tactics of psychological warfare against pirates. They used the execution of high-profile pirates as a way to deter others from continuing in the trade. Pirates were hanged in public, their bodies often left to rot as a warning to others. These executions, combined with the increasing military presence in the Caribbean, had a significant psychological impact on the pirate community. The sense of invincibility that pirates had once felt was shattered, and many began to realize that the British Empire's resolve to wipe out piracy was unwavering. While the British Navy was undoubtedly the main force in crushing piracy, the pirates' downfall was also linked to the broader shift in the global economy. As the transatlantic slave trade, which had been a key part of pirate smuggling operations, became more regulated and controlled by colonial powers, the pirates lost a key source of revenue. Smuggling operations, which had once been a profitable business, became increasingly risky as customs enforcement improved. The golden age of piracy had coincided with a period of economic upheaval, when the power dynamics in the Caribbean were in flux. However, by the 18th century, the European powers had consolidated their control over the region, leaving pirates with fewer opportunities to exploit. Though piracy in the Caribbean never completely disappeared, the aggressive military campaigns and the changing economic landscape rendered it less viable. Pirates who once thrived on the high seas were slowly eradicated, and by the mid-18th century, piracy in the Caribbean had been largely suppressed. The legacy of the pirates, however, lived on in the stories and myths they left behind. Their legend persisted in literature, folklore, and even in modern films that romanticized their lives and adventures. But in reality, the pirates' downfall was as brutal and violent as the world they had created. The Caribbean, once ruled by pirates and smugglers, began to transform into a more regulated and orderly world, with European powers asserting their dominance over the region's resources. The pirates who had once terrorized the seas were now little more than a distant memory. Their influence on the region diminished but never entirely erased. As the Caribbean entered a new era, the pirates faded into legend, becoming the stuff of myth, their true legacy hidden beneath the waves of history. The legacy of the pirates who once ruled the Caribbean is far from simple. While their dominance over the seas came to an end in the 18th century, the effects of their actions continue to echo throughout history. These pirates weren't just criminals on the fringes of society. They were central figures in shaping the Caribbean's economic, political, and cultural landscape. Even as the last pirate ship sailed into history, their influence remained embedded in the foundations of the Caribbean islands, in the stories they left behind, and in the lasting impact of their illicit trade. The most obvious legacy of Caribbean piracy lies in the cultural mythos that still surrounds the region. Pirate lore, with its tales of buried treasure, bloodthirsty captains, and mysterious islands, has become a cornerstone of Caribbean culture. Stories of pirates like Blackbeard, Henry Morgan, and Bartholomew Roberts continue to capture the imagination of people around the world. These figures have been immortalized in literature, films, and tourism, with places like Nassau in the Bahamas and Tortuga in Haiti marketing themselves as the former homes of legendary pirates. While the reality of piracy was far darker and more brutal than the colorful tales told in Hollywood, the romance and allure of the pirate world have remained a significant part of the Caribbean's cultural identity. In the modern era, the image of pirates has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the Caribbean. Hollywood's portrayal of the Pirates of the Caribbean, particularly through the success of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, has further cemented the region's association with swashbuckling adventurers. These films, while fictional, have had a significant impact on the tourism industry in the Caribbean. Tourist destinations that boast pirate history, including tours of supposed pirate caves and shipwrecks, have become major draws for visitors looking to experience a piece of the pirate past. The global popularity of pirate-themed attractions, including theme parks and festivals, is a testament to how the legacy of piracy continues to shape the cultural landscape. However, the true legacy of Caribbean piracy is far more complicated than just colorful myths and tourist attractions. Pirates were often involved in the illegal trade of enslaved people, weapons, and goods, playing a significant role in the transatlantic slave trade and the global flow of illicit goods. The smuggling networks they set up in the Caribbean were responsible for trafficking not just stolen goods but also human lives. Pirates were integral to the survival of the slave trade, providing a way for enslaved people to be brought into the Caribbean and sold at markets that fueled the plantation economy. While piracy brought wealth to some, it also left a legacy of exploitation, violence, and suffering. The Caribbean, during the height of piracy, was a region rife with brutality. both at the hands of the pirates themselves and colonial authorities. Smugglers, pirates, and merchants alike capitalized on the cheap labor provided by enslaved Africans, creating an economy that thrived on human misery. The legacy of this violence and exploitation remains embedded in the Caribbean's history, particularly in the African diaspora that shaped the island's culture and societies. Despite the decline of piracy by the mid-18th century, the systems of smuggling and illicit trade that pirates created did not disappear. The pirates who once ran these operations may have been driven into hiding or killed, but their methods lived on. Over time, organized crime syndicates took up the mantle, using similar tactics to smuggle drugs, weapons, and contraband across the Caribbean and into the Americas. The rise of modern-day drug cartels, especially in the 20th century, mirrors the smuggling operations of the pirates, with criminal enterprises once again exploiting the region's geographical position to traffic illicit goods. In many ways, the smuggling routes created by the pirates still exist today. The same small islands, remote coves, and hidden beaches that pirates once used to stash their treasures are now used by drug traffickers to conceal their operations. The Caribbean continues to be a major transit point for illegal shipments, with narcotics, weapons, and even human trafficking passing through the same waters where pirates once sailed. The legacy of these pirate smuggling operations continues to shape the modern-day Caribbean, as illicit trade remains a significant issue in the region. The question of whether piracy ever truly disappeared is one that still lingers. While the pirate ships may no longer roam the Caribbean seas, the networks they built and the methods they employed have endured. Piracy, in its various forms, continues to thrive in the shadows, adapting to the modern world. The pirates of the 17th and 18th centuries may have been driven off by military campaigns and colonial crackdowns, but their legacy of secrecy, smuggling, and resistance to authority continues to inspire those who operate outside the law. Even in the digital age, piracy remains a persistent problem. The rise of cyber piracy, where criminals hijack digital networks and hold valuable information for ransom, is a modern-day iteration of the piracy that once plagued the Caribbean. Though the seas may no longer be the primary battleground for pirates, the tactics of piracy, hijacking, deception, and extortion have found new life in the world of technology and global commerce. One of the most intriguing aspects of the continuing mystery surrounding pirates is the idea of buried treasure. The tales of pirates hiding vast fortunes on remote islands have captivated people for centuries, fueling treasure hunts and archaeological expeditions in the Caribbean. While many of these stories are likely to be exaggerated, the allure of buried treasure continues to drive modern-day explorers to search for lost pirate riches. Various expeditions have claimed to uncover artifacts and gold from pirate ships wrecked in the Caribbean, and the search for pirate treasure remains a popular pastime for treasure hunters. However, the real treasure of the Caribbean pirates is not gold or jewels. It is the lasting impact they had on the region and the world. Pirates were not just thieves, they were part of a larger system of global trade, one that intertwined with colonialism, slavery, and smuggling. Their actions helped shape the economies of the Caribbean islands, the United States, and Europe. The smuggling routes they created, the networks they established, and the secrets they kept all played a role in shaping the modern world. Their legacy is more than just the treasure they left behind. It is the deep-seated influence they had on the history of the Caribbean and the world. Even as pirates' reign over the seas has come to an end, their shadow still looms large. Their story is one of rebellion, opportunism, and exploitation. A story that continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world. The pirates of the Caribbean were more than just criminals. They were complex figures who left behind a legacy that is still felt today. Whether through the romanticized image of the pirate in popular culture, the continuing prevalence of smuggling operations in the Caribbean, or the global impact of their actions, the pirate story is far from over. As the Caribbean continues to deal with the challenges of modern-day crime and illicit trade, the pirates' legacy remains a powerful reminder of the region's complex and often brutal history. The continuing mystery of piracy, the treasure hunts, the legends, and the smuggling operations, continues to captivate us, reminding us that some stories, no matter how much time passes, are never fully buried. As we reflect on the pirates who once ruled the Caribbean, we are left with a mixture of awe, horror, and curiosity. The Caribbean, a place of stunning beauty and cultural richness, was also a haven for some of the most dangerous and cunning criminals to ever sail the seas. Pirates, far from the whimsical figures we often see in movies, were ruthless opportunists who thrived in a world shaped by colonial greed, slavery, and illicit trade. Their rise to power was not simply about stealing treasure. It was a calculated rebellion against the colonial authorities, a response to the deeply entrenched systems of exploitation that dominated the New World. They were not just outlaws, they were the product of a system that valued profit over human life, a system that forced individuals into rebellion for survival. The pirates, in their pursuit of wealth and freedom, exposed the contradictions and flaws of the empires that sought to control the Caribbean. However, as the centuries passed, the pirate world began to unravel. The colonial powers, growing stronger and more organized, mounted a coordinated response to crush piracy. The British Navy, with its powerful ships and vast resources, made it clear that piracy in the Caribbean would not be tolerated. Pirates, once the kings of the seas, found themselves hunted, captured, and executed in droves. The decline of piracy, though inevitable, marked the end of an era in Caribbean history, a time when the Caribbean was a lawless frontier, ruled by pirates who answered to no one but themselves. But the pirate legacy did not fade quietly into history. Instead, it became immortalized in stories, books, films, and even the tourism industry. The pirates of the Caribbean, with their colorful personalities, adventurous exploits, and hidden treasures, became icons of rebellion and freedom. Hollywood's portrayal of pirates, particularly through the Pirates of the Caribbean films, redefined the image of the pirate, blending historical fact with fantasy and creating an enduring mythos that captivates audiences to this day. Yet beneath the myth lies the darker reality of piracy's impact on the Caribbean. Pirates may have been the heroes of their own stories, but their actions left scars on the region that can still be felt today. Their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, their exploitation of the natural resources of the Caribbean, and their violent tactics all contributed to the complex and often painful history of the islands. The legacy of piracy is intertwined with the legacy of colonialism, slavery, and smuggling, creating a web of influence that shaped the Caribbean's past and continues to impact its present. The pirates of the Caribbean may no longer roam the seas, but their legacy is far from over. Their story is one of rebellion, survival, and tragedy, of men and women who defied the odds to create their own world in a harsh and unforgiving environment. In the end, the pirates of the Caribbean remind us of the power of myth, the persistence of history, and the enduring allure of the sea.